539 million years ago, Earth began leaving a clearer diary in stone. Shells settled into ancient mud. Fish learned new ways to move. Forests rose, continents collided, dinosaurs vanished, mammals spread. Ice carved the land. And finally, very late in the story, humans arrived to read the record back. Welcome to Calm Earth Science. This is Earth's deep time journey through the Phanerozoic Eon, a slow passage from Cambrian seas to the living world around us now. Thank you for spending your time here. It means a great deal. If this kind of calm science storytelling helps you relax, learn, or drift into quiet thought, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys Earth's ancient history. And gently, let us know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Now, let the long story of visible life begin. The Phanerozoic Eon begins in the sea, but not in a sea that is empty or new. By the time this long chapter opens, Earth has already been a living planet for an almost difficult length of time. Microbes have been working through oceans, rocks, and air for billions of years. Oxygen has slowly changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. Continents have gathered, broken, drifted, and gathered again. Ice has reached across the planet and retreated. Long before animals with shells became common, life was already present in quieter forms, often small, soft, and easily lost after death. What changes near the beginning of the Cambrian Period is not the first appearance of life itself. What changes is the way life begins to show itself. The name Phanerozoic means visible life, and it is a useful name because the rocks become easier to read. Bodies become firmer, skeletons appear, shells collect on the sea floor, animals disturb the mud and leave tracks, burrows, and feeding marks behind. For the first time in Earth history, the living world begins to leave a record dense enough that a whole landscape of ancient behaviour can be followed through stone. The ocean at this time is not yet filled with the familiar animals of later ages. There are no whales moving through deep water, no coral reefs in their modern form, no fish-filled coastal shallows like those of today. The continents are still mostly bare. Land has weather, rivers, rock, and sediment, but not forests or grasslands or animal paths. Most visible life belongs to the water. In shallow marine basins, sunlight falls through the upper layers of the sea, and fine sediment settles in quiet places. Along those muddy bottoms, animals begin to move with a new kind of consequence. Some crawl, some dig, some filter food from the water, some scrape across surfaces, some protect themselves with hard outer coverings. These actions may sound small, but in deep time, small actions repeated over millions of years can change the nature of an entire environment. A burrowing animal does not simply pass through mud. It opens the sediment, brings oxygen downward, and changes how nutrients move. A shell does not simply protect a body. It adds minerals to the cycle of burial and preservation. A moving animal does not simply cross a surface. It leaves a trace that can survive after the body has disappeared. This is one of the quiet turning points of the early Phanerozoic. Life is no longer only living in the environment. It is beginning to rearrange the environment in visible, physical ways. The event often called the Cambrian explosion can sound more sudden than it really was. Nothing about it happens in a single instant. It unfolds over millions of years, across seas that differ from one place to another, under changing chemistry, climate, and geography. Still, the change is striking. The fossil record begins to show a wide variety of animals in a relatively short span of geological time. Trilobites become common and recognizable, with segmented bodies and hard external skeletons. Other marine invertebrates appear in many forms. some simple to place within broad groups, others strange enough that their exact relationships remain difficult. There are animals with spines, plates, jointed limbs, soft bodies, grasping parts, and eyes. Some of these forms will leave descendants or relatives that continue far into the future. Others will vanish, leaving behind only their fossils and the sense that early animal life explored more possibilities than later ecosystems preserved. That is part of what makes the Cambrian feel so alive in the record. It is not a neat beginning with everything already pointing toward the modern world. It is more like a crowded workshop of body plans, some durable, some brief, some difficult to interpret. The seafloor becomes a place where anatomy and behaviour are being tested in many directions at once. Trilobites are among the clearest figures in this early world, but they are not the whole story. They moved across the mud, molted their outer skeletons, searched for food, and occupied many marine settings. Their fossils are common enough that they can make the Cambrian seem almost familiar, yet the world around them would still have felt deeply unfamiliar. Many animals from this time have no simple modern counterpart in ordinary imagination. Some are known from exceptional fossil sites, where soft tissues were buried quickly enough to survive as impressions. Those rare deposits matter because most soft-bodied creatures decay too quickly to fossilize. Without them, the Cambrian would look much poorer than it really was, as though only the hard parts of life existed. Instead, these windows show that the early ocean held a larger and more delicate variety of animals than shells alone could reveal. The record is generous in places, but it is never complete. Every fossil is a survival from a much larger absence. It shows one body, one surface, one moment of burial, while implying all the lives that left no trace at all. That incompleteness keeps the Cambrian from becoming too simple. The evidence is strong enough to show a major expansion of animal life, but broken enough to remind geology to remain careful. The causes of this expansion are also not likely to be one thing. Oxygen matters, because active bodies need energy, and oxygen helps support movement, digestion, muscles, and nervous systems. But oxygen alone does not explain the rise of shells, eyes, limbs, burrows, and new feeding strategies. Ecology matters as well. Once some animals begin to move more actively, other animals must respond. Once predation becomes more important, protection becomes more valuable. Once bodies can dig, hide, chase, cling, or filter, the seafloor changes from a passive surface into a living arena. Evolution is no longer shaped only by temperature, chemistry, and water depth. It is also shaped by the pressure of other organisms. A predator changes the world for its prey. A burrower changes the sediment for animals living nearby. A hard shell changes the odds of survival, and also the odds of being remembered in stone. In this way, early animal life begins to create part of its own environment. The Cambrian Ocean is not dramatic in the loud sense. Its drama is quieter and more durable. It is the drama of bodies becoming possible, then common, then influential. It is the drama of mud no longer staying smooth for long. It is the drama of the first ecosystems complex enough to leave behind patterns of interaction, not only isolated remains, on land. The contrast is sharp. The continents at this stage are important, but they are not yet green worlds. Rock breaks under weather. Rivers carry grains and dissolved minerals toward the sea. Coastlines shift as water rises and falls. But the surfaces of the continents lack the thick cover that later plants will provide. No forests hold the soil. No roots knit hillsides together. No insects move through leaf litter. The main theatre of visible life remains offshore, where sediment can bury remains and preserve clues. This gives the early Phanerozoic a particular shape. The land supplies material, the ocean receives it. In that receiving basin, life leaves its signatures. A trackway across ancient mud records motion. A cluster of shells records death, transport, or quiet accumulation. A burrow records a body that may never be found, but whose behaviour pressed itself into the sea floor. These traces make the Phanerozoic different from the older Earth. They allow life to be followed not only as chemistry, but as form and movement. The beginning of the eon is therefore less like a curtain rising on a completed stage and more like a record becoming clearer after a long, dim prelude. There is still uncertainty everywhere. The exact relationships among some Cambrian animals remain debated. The timing and causes of diversification are still studied. The links between environmental change, oxygen, genes, development, and ecology remain complicated. Yet the broad pattern is firm. Early in the Paleozoic, the oceans fill with animals whose bodies and behaviours reshape the seafloor and deepen the fossil record. The Phanerozoic starts with this widening of visibility. It starts with life becoming easier for Earth to remember. Later sections of this eon will move onto land, into forests, through mass extinctions, across the rise of reptiles and dinosaurs, and eventually into ice ages and human arrival. But the first movement belongs to the Cambrian Sea. In its mud, shells, traces, and strange preserved bodies. The long story of visible life begins to gather its first lasting detail. Skeletons changed the early oceans in a way that was quiet at first, then almost impossible to undo. A soft body can live, feed, reproduce, and vanish so completely that the sea seems to close over it without memory. A hard part behaves differently. It resists decay for a little longer. It can be buried before it is broken apart. It can collect with other remains, forming a layer that says not only that animals lived here, but that their bodies had begun to carry minerals drawn from the world around them. In the early Paleozoic seas, this was one of the great changes. Life was not only making shapes, it was making shapes sturdy enough for stone to keep. The result is a fossil record with far more texture than before, filled with shells, plates, spines, segments, and fragments from animals that once moved through warm, shallow water or settled on ancient sea floors. Trilobites are the most famous of these animals, partly because their bodies fossilized well and partly because they were so successful for so long. Their hard outer skeleton was divided into a head, a middle region of many segments, and a tail. That design was flexible enough to serve many ways of life. Some trilobites crawled over muddy bottoms, some likely searched through sediment for food, some swam or hovered near the sea floor. Some could roll into a guarded shape, bringing their hard surfaces together as protection. Their eyes, when preserved, are among the most striking details in early animal history, built from mineral lenses rather than soft tissue alone. A trilobite fossil can look still and simple in a museum drawer, but the living animal was part of a working sea, responding to light, touch, current, hunger, and danger. Its outer skeleton was not permanent in life. Like many arthropods, it had to molt, shedding one hard covering so the body could grow beneath a new one. That means some fossil trilobites are not dead animals in the ordinary sense, but empty suits left behind by animals that had already moved on. The seafloor held their bodies, their molts, their tracks, and sometimes their clustered remains, turning an active life into a complicated record of presence. Around and among them, other invertebrates were building their own kind of permanence. Brachiopods, small shelled animals that attached to surfaces or rested on sediment, became widespread in Paleozoic seas. Their shells can resemble clams at a glance, but they belong to a different branch of life, organized in a different way. Ancient reefs and seafloor communities also included sponges and early coral-like animals. some forming rigid structures that rose from the bottom and created shelter, edges, and pockets where other organisms could live. Echinoderms, the broader group that would later include sea stars and sea urchins, appeared in forms that often look unfamiliar. With plated bodies and stalked shapes fixed to the sea floor, crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, lifted feathery feeding arms into the water and strained passing particles from the current. They were animals, not plants, but in dense groups they could make parts of the seafloor look like a slow underwater meadow. Their broken stems and plates would later contribute to limestones, each small piece a remnant of bodies that once filtered the moving sea. The important thing about these animals is not only that they existed, it is that they began to give marine environments a new architecture. A plain surface of mud or carbonate sediment could become a place of attachment, filtering, grazing, hiding, and competition. Hard skeletons created relief, shells made obstacles, reefs and reef-like structures changed water flow. Burrows changed the chemistry below the surface. Predators and scavengers found new opportunities among the remains. The ocean bottom was becoming more layered as a habitat, not just in sediment but in living structure. This had consequences for evolution. Once hard parts became common, they altered the terms of survival. Armor could defend, spines could discourage attack, a shell could protect soft organs. But protection also invited new ways of feeding. Some predators learned to crush, drill, pry, or swallow. Others attacked soft parts when animals were exposed during molting or movement. The early Paleozoic was not a peaceful aquarium of simple creatures. It was a world in which the struggle to feed and avoid being eaten was shaping form after form. The evidence for this struggle often comes indirectly, from repaired injuries, broken shells, defensive shapes, or feeding traces left behind. These clues matter because they show that skeletons were not just passive coverings. They were part of an evolutionary conversation between danger and defense. Mineralized bodies also changed the chemistry of the planet in subtle ways. When animals used calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate, silica, and other materials to build hard parts, they joined biological activity to the movement of minerals through the ocean. After death, those hard parts might dissolve, be eaten, be ground into grains by waves, or settle into sediment and remain. Over long spans of time, they helped build rock. Limestone beds can contain the remains of shelled animals, crinoids, corals, and other marine life, compressed into a record that is both biological and geological. A cliff of ancient limestone may seem like a wall of pale stone, but under close study it can become a crowded archive of seafloor life. Yet even this richer record is selective. Hard parts survive better than soft tissues, and that can make the ancient ocean look more skeletal than it truly was. Many soft animals must have lived among the shelled and plated forms, feeding, drifting, hiding, or dissolving after death without leaving much behind. Some are known only because unusual burial conditions captured them before decay erased them. The danger in reading the Paleozoic record is to mistake what fossilizes easily for what mattered most. Trilobites and brachiopods are abundant in part because they were genuinely common, but also because their bodies had the right materials to endure. The lost softness of these oceans is harder to measure. It is present as a shadow around the record, reminding science that the fossil archive is not the ancient world itself, but the portion of it that passed through the narrow gate of preservation. Still, what remains is enough to show marine ecosystems becoming increasingly complex. Food webs were no longer simple chains. Filter feeders removed particles from water. Grazers worked across surfaces. Deposit feeders processed sediment. Predators searched for prey. Scavengers used what death left behind. Reef builders and attached animals created places for others to settle. Even the mud became less stable as burrowing animals mixed it from within. This mixing, often called bioturbation, is one of the less dramatic but more important changes of early animal life. Before widespread burrowing, microbial mats could cover sediment surfaces and hold them together. As animals dug and churned the sea floor, those mats were disturbed. Sediment became more oxygenated in some places and more patchy in others. The sea floor lost some of its old smoothness. It became worked, loosened, and inhabited downward. In that sense, the rise of visible animal life did not only add creatures to the ocean, it changed the ocean floor into a more active boundary between water, chemistry, and biology. Through the Ordovician and into later Paleozoic time, this marine expansion continued. The seas saw major diversifications of shelled invertebrates, reef communities, and animals that filled many ecological roles. Not every interval was stable. Sea levels shifted, continents moved, climates changed, extinctions interrupted the pattern. But the broad direction in early Paleozoic marine life was toward richer ecosystems, where more animals were doing more things in more ways. The names of the groups can sometimes make this world feel distant trilobites, brachiopods, bryozoans, nautiloid cephalopods, crinoids, rugose corals, tabulate corals. Yet behind every name is a simple fact of living matter. Something had to gather food. Something had to grow. Something had to hold its place against a current or move away from danger. Something had to reproduce before it disappeared. The old seas were not symbolic. They were practical, crowded, and physical. Their inhabitants were solving ordinary problems in forms that now seem strange, because the world around them has changed so completely. The early Phanerozoic ocean therefore becomes a place where geology and biology are almost impossible to separate. The animals drew minerals from seawater, their bodies fell into sediment, their remains made rock. That rock later rose, folded, eroded, and exposed its fossils to air. A shell that began as protection could become a grain in limestone, then a clue in a hillside, then part of a larger reconstruction of ancient climate, water depth, and ecology. This is the quiet power of skeletons in deep time. They do not preserve everything, and they do not speak plainly, but they give the ancient sea edges, textures, and recurring forms. They allow the beginning of the Phanerozoic to be followed not as a blur of life, but as a growing arrangement of animals and environments. By the end of this early marine expansion, the oceans are no longer merely the place where visible life begins. They are structured worlds, filled with bodies that defend, filter, crawl, attach, molt, break, and accumulate. The sea floor has become an archive, and the archive is already full of movement. Long before the oceans held the swift bodies of tuna, the heavy shadows of whales, or the bright movement of reef fish. The first vertebrate story was taking shape in quieter water. It begins with animals that would not have looked powerful at first glance. Many early fish were small, jawless, and heavily armoured, with bodies built more for searching along the bottom or drawing in food than for fast pursuit. Yet their importance is difficult to overstate, because inside these modest animals was a new organisation of the body. A backbone, or something close to it in earlier forms, gave internal support. A head gathered senses toward the front. Muscles worked along the body in repeating bands. Movement became more directed. The animal was no longer only a soft shape passing through water, or a shelled creature tied closely to the sea floor. It carried its main support inside itself. That change would eventually matter for sharks, bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and humans. Though none of that future was visible in the early Paleozoic sea, at the beginning It was simply another way of living in water, jawless fish, often grouped under broad names that cover many extinct forms, moved through marine and freshwater environments while the world around them kept rearranging. Some wore bony plates like shields over the front of the body, some likely fed by suction or by taking in small particles and soft material. Without jaws, they could not bite in the familiar sense. But they did not need to resemble later predators in order to succeed. They belonged to ecosystems already crowded with invertebrates, reefs, burrows, shells, and shifting sediments. Their bodies added a different kind of motion to those waters, a more flexible swimming line, a new use of the inner skeleton, and a set of senses increasingly aimed into the space ahead. The rise of jaws changed that story again. A jaw is easy to take for granted because so many later animals have one. But in deep time it is a serious invention. It changes feeding from passive intake or simple scraping into gripping, cutting, crushing, and more controlled attack. It changes defense, because a body that can bite can answer danger differently. It changes competition, because food that once lay out of reach can become available. Jaws probably evolved from earlier support structures around the gills, modified over time into a feeding apparatus. That is a very deep kind of transformation. One body part slowly taking on a new role until the animal becomes capable of a new way of life. With jaws came paired fins that could give better steering and stability. Fish were becoming more maneuverable, more varied, and more ecologically forceful. In the Silurian and Devonian seas, this shift helped open a wider range of possibilities. Sharks and their relatives appeared with skeletons made mostly of cartilage rather than bone. That cartilage rarely fossilizes as completely as hard bone. So teeth and other resistant pieces often carry much of their record. Even so, the basic shark design would prove remarkably durable. A flexible body, strong senses, replaceable teeth, and efficient swimming made sharks one of the lasting experiments of vertebrate evolution. They were not modern sharks in every detail, and the oceans they lived in were not modern oceans, but the outline of a successful predatory way of life was already present. Alongside them, bony fish developed another path. Bone gave different structural possibilities. Fins, skulls, scales, and internal supports could diversify in many directions. Some bony fish belonged to ray-finned lineages, with fins supported by slender rays. Others belonged to lobe-finned lineages, whose fleshy fins contained bones arranged in ways that would later become important for the move toward land. At the time, those fins were not steps in a planned journey. They were useful in water, especially in shallow, weedy, or complex habitats where pushing, bracing, and maneuvering could matter. Only later would some of those features become part of a much larger transition. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes, and the phrase is fair if it is held gently. It does not mean fish alone ruled a simple world. Marine invertebrates still filled the seas, reefs grew and declined, plants were spreading on land, the atmosphere and climate were changing, but vertebrate life in water became especially diverse and visible during this time. Armored jawless fish continued in some settings. Jawed armored fish, including placoderms, became major animals in Devonian waters. Some were small, some were large and formidable, with heavy head armour and biting plates rather than teeth like those of later sharks. Their success shows that early jawed vertebrates did not move along one narrow road toward the present. Many branches opened. Some lasted for a while and ended. Others passed traits forward through descendants. Evolution in this period feels less like a straight line than a river delta, splitting again and again, with only some channels remaining open. Around these animals, the continents were not still. Paleozoic geography was a moving foundation. Earlier land masses had separated from older supercontinental arrangements, and through the Paleozoic they shifted across latitudes, collided, flooded, and exposed shallow continental shelves. These movements mattered for life because continents shape seas. When sea level rises over the edges of continents, shallow marine habitats spread widely. Sunlit water covers broad platforms, creating places where reefs, shell beds, fish, and invertebrates can thrive. When sea level falls, those habitats shrink, fragment, or disappear. A fish lineage does not experience plate tectonics as a grand theory. It experiences coastlines moving, basins opening, water chemistry changing, and habitats connecting or closing across generations. Slow continental motion becomes biological pressure when it changes where animals can live. During the early and middle Paleozoic, large continents and smaller terrains occupied positions unlike those of the modern map. Laurentia, Baltica, Siberia, and Gondwana were among the major pieces of this shifting world. Oceans opened between some of them and narrowed between others. Collisions built mountain belts and changed erosion. Rivers carried sediment and nutrients into the sea. Volcanic activity and weathering affected the chemistry of oceans and air. These processes did not act separately from life. They formed the background conditions in which life diversified, suffered, and recovered. A reef community might depend on warm, shallow water that existed because a continental shelf lay near the tropics. A fish fauna might spread through connected seas, then become isolated as land masses moved or sea levels changed. A cooling climate might reduce some habitats while favouring others. Deep time is full of these slow negotiations between moving rock and living bodies. The Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian worlds also remind us that the ocean has never been one uniform place. Tropical shelves, deeper basins, river mouths, lagoons, reefs, and inland waters each offered different conditions. Early vertebrates entered that variety unevenly. Some remained marine, some moved into brackish or freshwater settings. Freshwater mattered because it placed fish into rivers, lakes, floodplains, and seasonal waters tied closely to the land. These places could be unstable, low in oxygen, crowded, or temporary. They could reward animals able to breathe differently, move through tight spaces, or tolerate change. In such settings, features that later seem important for land may have had practical value long before true land life became possible for vertebrates. Lungs or lung-like organs, strong fins, and flexible bodies could help an animal survive difficult water before they ever helped it cross a muddy margin. The story is therefore not a heroic climb from sea to shore. It is a quieter accumulation of useful traits inside complicated habitats. Fish were not trying to leave the ocean. They were living where water itself was diverse and sometimes demanding. Climate added another layer. The Paleozoic included warm intervals, high seas, glaciations, and changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen. At the end of the Ordovician, a major extinction struck marine life, linked to severe climate change and glaciation as Gondwana moved over the South Pole. Later, ecosystems recovered and diversified again, but recovery did not restore the same world exactly. Each extinction removes some possibilities and leaves others to expand. Fish evolution took place within that uneven rhythm. The rise of jawed forms, the spread of bony fish, and the success of cartilaginous predators all unfolded against a background where oceans could open generously and then become harsh. This is one reason the fossil record feels both abundant and interrupted. There are long patterns, but they are crossed by losses. There is innovation, but also disappearance. The armoured jawless fish that once seemed so prominent would decline. Placoderms, powerful in Devonian waters, would vanish by the end of that period. sharks and bony fish would continue, altered by time, carrying forward designs that could survive the closing of some evolutionary doors. By the later Paleozoic, vertebrate life in water had become a central part of Earth's visible history. The seas no longer belonged mainly to shelled invertebrates and soft-bottom dwellers. They also held animals with backbones, jaws, paired fins, armour, teeth, and internal skeletons. Some patrolled open water, some moved near the bottom, some entered rivers and floodplains. Some lineages were already close, in structure and habitat, to the later animals that would make the shoreline one of the most important boundaries in the history of life. Beneath that biological change, the planet continued its slow tectonic work. Continents drifted toward future collisions. Oceans changed their shapes. Mountain building began preparing sediments and climates that would matter far beyond the sea. The fish of the Paleozoic did not live on a fixed stage. They lived on a planet whose geography was always becoming something else. In that moving world, the backbone became a durable experiment, the jaw became a powerful tool, and the ocean became the place where vertebrate history first learned to travel through changing Earth. Plants did not arrive on land as forests. They arrived as small, low, fragile life at the edge of water, where wet rock, thin sediment, and brief exposure made survival possible for only part of the time. The first green surfaces on the continents would have looked modest beside the later coal forests and towering trees of the Paleozoic. There were no trunks lifting canopies into the air, no seeds, no flowers, no deep roots holding hillsides together. Early land plants were simple by later standards, but their simplicity should not hide what they were beginning to do. They were changing the continents from bare mineral surfaces into places where life could cling, spread, decay, and alter the movement of water. For most of Earth history before this, the land had been largely a physical landscape. Wind wore it down. Rain struck exposed stone. Rivers carried loose grains toward the sea. Microbial films may have lived in damp places. And fungi or fungus-like organisms may have helped prepare surfaces. But the continents did not yet have the thick biological skin that later generations would treat as normal. When plants began to establish themselves beyond the water, that skin began to form. It started thinly, in patches, along shorelines, floodplains, and wet ground. But deep time gives small beginnings enough room to become planetary changes. A plant on land faces problems that an aquatic plant does not meet in the same way. Water no longer surrounds the whole body. Drying becomes a danger. Gravity matters more. Reproduction becomes harder when swimming cells cannot always move freely through water. Sunlight is abundant, but sunlight also brings exposure. Carbon dioxide is available in the air, but taking it in can mean losing moisture. The move onto land therefore required more than simply growing outside the sea. It required bodies that could resist drying, tissues that could move water upward, surfaces that could exchange gases, and reproductive cycles that could survive in damp but uncertain conditions. These features did not appear all at once. They accumulated in lineages that were already tied to water, slowly making the land less hostile and more habitable. The earliest land plants were probably close in habit to small bryophyte-like forms, plants without the full internal plumbing of later vascular plants. They would have depended on moisture and remained low to the ground. Even so, they began a new relationship with rock and air. Their cells captured carbon from the atmosphere and built living tissue. When they died, that tissue decayed into the surface, helping create organic matter in soils that had never held much of it before. Roots in the modern sense were not yet present, but even simple anchoring structures and associated microbes could help trap sediment and slow erosion. The continent was no longer only weathered from above and carried away by water. It was being touched, shaded, held, and chemically worked by life. That mattered for the sea as well. Rivers connect land to ocean, and any change on land eventually sends a signal downstream. As plants spread, weathering patterns changed. Minerals moved differently. Sediment delivery altered. Nutrients such as phosphorus could be released or trapped in new ways, affecting marine productivity and, over long times, the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. The arrival of plants was not a separate land story placed beside the marine story. It was a new coupling between continents and seas. The green margin on land began to feed back into the water, where the earlier animal radiations had unfolded. During the Silurian and Devonian, land plants became more complex and more visible in the fossil record. Vascular tissue, the internal system that transports water and nutrients, allowed plants to stand taller and live farther from constantly wet surfaces. Once water could be moved through the body more efficiently, height became possible. Height brought access to light and the chance to release spores into moving air. Stems branched. Surfaces became more specialized. Rooting systems deepened from simple holdfasts into structures that could penetrate sediment and rock more effectively. This did not instantly create a forest, but it changed the rules. Plants were no longer only damp green films or low mats near water. They were becoming three-dimensional parts of the landscape. A small upright stem may seem minor beside an animal with jaws or armor, but it marks a different kind of expansion. Animals move through a habitat, plants build one by remaining in place. As they spread, they made shade, trapped moisture, offered surfaces for microbes and small animals, and created pockets of decaying matter. Insects and other arthropods would later take advantage of these spaces, but the structure had to come first. The early land plant world was quiet, without birdsong, mammals, or flowering meadows, yet it was not empty. It was becoming textured. The Devonian brought some of the first true forests, and with them a deeper transformation of the land. Plants such as Archaeopteris grew with tree-like form, woody tissue, and more complex roots. These forests were not modern forests, but they introduced a new kind of vertical world. Trunks rose from floodplains. Branches held leaves or leaf-like structures in the air. Roots entered the ground with enough force and depth to change soil formation. This was one of the most important shifts in the history of the continents. A rooted forest slows runoff. It breaks rock chemically and physically. It stores carbon in wood and soil. It changes local humidity, stream behavior, and the stability of river banks. Rivers flowing through a world with roots do not behave exactly like rivers flowing through bare sediment. Channels can become more stable. Floodplains can hold more organic material. The land begins to keep some of what weathering once gave quickly to the sea. The atmosphere also feels the change, though not in a simple or immediate way. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. Burial of plant material can lock carbon away, especially when decay is incomplete. Over long intervals, the spread of plants likely contributed to shifts in atmospheric gases, including rising oxygen later in the Paleozoic. But this process depends on burial, decay, climate, and tectonics, not just plant growth itself. A living forest takes in carbon, but if its tissues decay fully, much of that carbon returns to the air. The deep time effect comes when some organic matter is buried faster than it is broken down, in swampy settings, especially later in the Carboniferous. Vast amounts of plant material would accumulate and eventually become coal. That later world will belong to another section, but its roots begin here, in the gradual invention of landscapes that could produce and preserve so much plant matter. The greening of land also changed the opportunities for animals. Before plants, the continents offered little food for large visible life. After plants, even simple ecosystems could support small arthropods, decomposers, and eventually more complex land communities. Dead plant tissue fed fungi and microbes. Living plants offered surfaces, shelter, and later food. Soil became a habitat rather than only broken rock. The earliest animals to move onto land did not enter a finished garden. They entered a rough, damp, uneven world where plant life was beginning to create cover and organic matter. In this sense, the movement of plants onto land prepared the stage for later vertebrates, not by designing it for them, but by changing the basic conditions. A shoreline with low plants and damp sediment is different from bare mud. A floodplain with roots and decaying stems is different from mineral flats. A forested river edge is different again. Each version of land offers new hazards and new shelter. It is easy to describe plant evolution as background because plants do not run, bite, or leave dramatic skeletons in the same way animals do. But in the Phanerozoic story, plants are not background. They are engineers of atmosphere, soil, water, and climate. Their work is slow and cumulative. A stem grows, dies, and falls. A root enters a crack. A spore travels across wet ground. A thin surface of life holds sediment through one storm, then another. None of these acts announces a revolution. Yet together they alter the planet more deeply than many faster events. By the time land plants are established, Earth has begun to acquire a new kind of memory. Not only shells in marine rock, not only tracks in seafloor mud, but soils, roots, spores, wood, and carbon-rich layers record the spread of life across the continents. The Paleozoic land surface, once mostly exposed and unstable, is becoming a living interface between rock and air. From that interface, the next crossings will become possible. Animals with limbs will approach the margins. Insects will find shelter and food. Reptiles will later move through drier ground. But before those movements can mean much, the land has to become more than land. It has to become habitat. And the first plants begin that change with a quiet persistence that reshapes everything downstream. The first vertebrates to approach land did not step out of the sea into a waiting world of forests, birds, and open ground. They came through shallow water, along muddy margins, in places where the difference between swimming and supporting the body could blur for a moment before the tide, the river, or the season changed again. This was not a clean passage from ocean to continent. It was a long, uneven occupation of edges, floodplains, lagoons, river channels, swampy flats, and weed-filled shallows offered water that could be warm, low in oxygen, crowded, or temporary. In those places, a body built only for open swimming was not always enough. It could help to push against the bottom. It could help to lift the head. It could help to breathe air when the water turned poor. It could help to move from one shrinking pool to another, not as a grand conquest of land, but as a practical answer to difficult water. The animals closest to this transition came from lobe-finned fish, a group whose fins contained sturdy internal bones and muscles rather than only delicate rays. In water, those fleshy fins could be useful for steering, bracing, and moving through cluttered habitats. Some of these fish also had lungs or lung-like organs, because air breathing can be valuable in stagnant water where dissolved oxygen runs low. These traits are easy to look backward upon, as if they were designed for land. But that is not how evolution works. They first made sense in the conditions where the animals already lived. A fin strong enough to press against the bottom might help in a shallow channel. A neck that allowed the head to move more freely might help when feeding near the surface or in tangled margins. A stronger skeleton might help in water made complicated by plants, sediment, roots, and current. Only later did such features become part of a different way of life. when the edge of water became not only a boundary but a passage. The Devonian period holds many of the fossils that make this story visible. Animals such as Tiktaalik show a mixture of fish-like and tetrapod-like traits, with fins that contain bones arranged in a pattern, suggesting the beginnings of wrist-like support, along with a flattened head and eyes placed high on the skull. It was still a fish, still a creature of water, but it shows how close some lineages had come to the kind of body that could work in very shallow environments. Other early tetrapods, including forms known from later Devonian rocks, had limbs with digits, though many of them were still strongly tied to aquatic life. Their limbs were not yet the neat walking tools of later land animals. Some had more than 5 digits. Some probably moved through water more than across dry ground. Their bodies still carried signs of gills, tails, and habits shaped by rivers and wetlands. The first tetrapods were not fully terrestrial pioneers marching over dry soil. They were animals of margins, and their world was wet. That detail matters because it softens the old image of a fish heroically leaving the ocean. The actual transition is stranger and more gradual. Land was not an empty prize. It was a set of problems. Gravity pressed harder without the lift of water. Skin could dry. Eggs and young could not yet survive far from moisture. Feeding changed because prey moved differently in air. Senses had to work across a new boundary, where sound, smell, and vision behaved differently than they did underwater. Every advantage came with a cost. A limb that could support the body was useful, but it required changes in shoulders, hips, spine, and muscles. A head lifted into air could breathe, but it also had to manage drying and the mechanics of swallowing. The shoreline was therefore not a simple doorway. It was a testing ground where each gain had to be fitted to the rest of the body, even after limbs appeared. The animals that bore them remained dependent on water for much of their lives. The later amphibian condition, with eggs laid in water and young developing in aquatic settings, gives a rough sense of this dependence. Though early tetrapods were not identical to modern amphibians, they belonged to a different ancient world. Around them, the land was becoming greener but was not yet familiar. Plants had spread across damp surfaces and were forming more complex stands in some regions. Roots were changing soils and riverbanks. Organic matter was building up in floodplain settings. Small arthropods were already present on land, feeding, hiding, and decomposing. For a vertebrate near the water's edge, the land may have offered new food and fewer large aquatic predators for brief intervals, but it also offered danger, exposure, and mechanical strain. The safest place was still often the water, even when the water itself was difficult. This gives the transition its quiet tension. Evolution was not pulling animals toward land as a final goal. It was shaping them in habitats where water and land kept interrupting one another. A drought could make air breathing useful. A flood could reconnect channels. A shallow pool could favour a body able to prop itself up. A muddy bank could make stronger fins useful without requiring true walking. Generation after generation, selection worked through these small circumstances, not through foresight. Over time, the result was a body plan that could cross a threshold no previous vertebrate had crossed in the same way. The tetrapod body was a new arrangement of old parts. Fins became limbs. Internal supports were reorganized. The skull changed. The spine and girdles took on new loads. The front and back pairs of appendages began to share the work of support and movement. These changes did not happen all at once, and they did not produce a single perfect design. Early tetrapods were varied, experimental, and often awkward by later standards. But they opened a future that would eventually include amphibians, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and the human body. That future should not be allowed to overwhelm the animals themselves. They were not half-finished versions of later creatures. They were complete organisms in their own settings, suited to vanished rivers, deltas, and wetlands. Their importance comes from the fact that one of their ways of living happened to leave descendants that moved farther onto land. There is also a deeper environmental connection. The move of vertebrates toward land could only happen because the land was already changing. Plants had begun making soils and cover. Arthropods had begun occupying terrestrial spaces. Rivers were interacting with rooted banks and organic debris. The shoreline was becoming biologically richer. Without that preparation, land would have been far less inviting and far less useful. The first tetrapods entered a world that plants had partly softened, not a bare stone continent. Yet the land was still demanding enough that dependence on water remained strong. The full escape from water-based reproduction would come later, with the evolution of the amniotic egg, an egg with internal membranes that help protect the developing embryo. That later innovation would allow early reptiles and their relatives to spread into drier environments more freely. But in this stage, the story remains close to mud, reeds, pools, and river margins. The great crossing is still only partial. That partial quality makes it more believable and more revealing. Major transitions in deep time often happen, not as leaps into entirely new worlds, but as expansions of behavior inside old ones. A fish that props itself in shallow water is not leaving its ancestry behind. It is using that ancestry under new pressure. A tetrapod that moves across a muddy flat is not finished becoming terrestrial. It is surviving a place where the old boundary is no longer firm. The fossil record catches fragments of this process: bones in sediment, footprints in ancient surfaces, skulls shaped for water and air, limbs that suggest support but not yet effortless walking. Each clue narrows the gap between fish and land vertebrate, yet none removes the complexity of the transition. The shoreline remains a place of overlap, not replacement. By the late Devonian and into the Carboniferous, tetrapods become more diverse, and some lineages grow larger, stronger, and more land-capable. Amphibian-like animals occupy wetlands and freshwater systems. Later, early reptiles will carry the story farther from the water's edge. But the first movement belongs to those uncertain margins where shallow water asks new things of vertebrate bodies. In that world, the land did not suddenly fill with crawling animals. It received them slowly, in damp steps. Through bodies still shaped by the sea and rivers that had made them, the threshold between water and land did not disappear. It became inhabited. The Carboniferous forests did not grow like quiet decoration on the edge of the Paleozoic world. They changed the ground beneath them, the air above them, and the animals that could move through their shade. By this time, land was no longer only a damp experiment beside rivers and coastlines. In many lowland regions, it had become thick with plants, especially in swampy basins where water slowed decay and buried fallen stems before they could fully return to the air. These forests were not modern forests. There were no flowering trees, no grasses underfoot, no birds in the branches, and no mammals moving through leaf litter. Much of the green world belonged to lycopsids, horsetail relatives, ferns, and seed ferns, with tall trunks rising from wet ground and root systems spreading through soft, unstable soil. Some lycopsid trees stood high enough to make the landscape feel enclosed, but their bodies were built differently from later trees, with outer tissues doing much of the work and a strange, almost temporary quality to their growth. They lived, shed, fell, and accumulated in places where water kept oxygen away from dead plant matter. Over long spans, that buried plant material would become coal, turning whole lost wetlands into dark seams inside the crust. A coal bed is not only fuel from an ancient world, it is compressed forest, swamp, climate, chemistry, and time, a layer made from countless plants that once stood in air and sank into waterlogged ground. The atmosphere itself was changing as these forests expanded. Photosynthesis had been releasing oxygen for a very long time, but the burial of large amounts of organic carbon during the Carboniferous helped push oxygen levels high by later Earth standards. That did not make the world gentle, it made it different. Fire may have been easier to sustain in some settings, insects and other arthropods, which breathe through systems of small tubes rather than lungs like vertebrates, could grow to sizes that seem unusual beside most modern forms. Some dragonfly-like relatives reached wingspans far beyond those of living dragonflies. Millipede-like arthropods could become large enough to leave trackways that suggest a heavy body moving over wet sediment. These animals did not become large simply because the air allowed it. Size depends on many pressures, including food, predators, development, and habitat. But the richer oxygen atmosphere likely widened what was possible for bodies that moved air through branching tubes. The Carboniferous forest was therefore not only a plant world, it was a layered habitat full of surfaces, shadows, rotting wood, spores, damp hollows, and moving invertebrates. Insects and their relatives found shelter in bark, soil, water margins, and decaying material. Some fed on plant tissues, others scavenged or preyed on smaller animals. Wings, once they appeared, added another dimension to terrestrial life. The air above the forest was no longer only a space for spores and weather. It became a route through which animals could travel, escape, search, and disperse. Early winged insects did not fill the sky in the modern way, but they opened a new ecological layer that had never existed before. A forest with flying insects is different from a forest without them. Movement becomes less bound to trunks, mud, and stems. Predators and prey meet in new ways. Reproduction, feeding, and dispersal gain new routes. The land was becoming more complicated not only because more organisms were present, but because they were using space differently. While arthropods were spreading through this green world, vertebrates remained tied to water in many important ways. Amphibian-like animals occupied rivers, ponds, swamps, and wet lowlands, some with broad heads, strong limbs, and bodies suited to moving between water and soft ground. They could be large predators in their habitats, but their reproduction still depended heavily on moisture. Eggs laid in water or very damp places limited how far such animals could truly move from aquatic settings. The next major change came with the amniotic egg. This was not just an egg with a tougher outer covering. It was a whole reproductive system built around membranes that protected the developing embryo, managed waste, and helped hold a private watery environment around the young animal. With that innovation, some vertebrates no longer had to return to open water in the same way to reproduce. The amniotic egg did not make land easy, but it loosened one of the strongest old ties to water. From this shift came early reptiles and their relatives, animals better able to occupy drier ground than the amphibian-like vertebrates before them. They were not yet the great reptiles of the Mesozoic. Many were small, low animals moving through forest floors, flood plains, and uplands that were only beginning to receive vertebrate life. Yet their importance lies in what their bodies allowed: skin better suited to resisting water loss, stronger support on land, and reproduction away from open water made a new kind of terrestrial life possible. The land was no longer only a place visited from the swamp, it could become home. The difference was gradual, and many early amniotes still lived close to moist habitats, but the direction had changed. Vertebrate life had found a way to carry some of its needed water inside the egg itself. That quiet solution would eventually make possible the later success of reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. In the Carboniferous, however, it remained part of a dense, humid, plant-filled world where the future was still hidden under ferns and fallen trunks. The geography beneath these ecosystems was also moving toward a closing pattern. Continents that had spent earlier Paleozoic times separated by oceans were drifting into collision. Mountain belts rose where land masses pressed together. Basins formed beside those mountains, gathering sediment, water, and plant debris. The assembly of Pangaea was not a single event but a long tectonic convergence, a gathering of continental pieces into a supercontinent that would dominate the later Paleozoic and early Mesozoic world. As these lands came together, climate patterns changed. Interior regions became farther from the moderating influence of the sea. Some areas grew drier and more seasonal. Glaciers spread across parts of the southern supercontinent Gondwana, locking water into ice and affecting sea level. The lush cold forests that had flourished in wet equatorial basins were not guaranteed a permanent world. Their habitats depended on water, low relief, burial conditions, and climate stability within certain limits. As the continents continued to gather, those conditions shifted. Forests fragmented, wetlands contracted in some regions, drier landscapes spread. The late Paleozoic world began to feel less like an open expansion of swampy life and more like a planet tightening into sharper contrasts. That tightening mattered for animals. Amphibian-like vertebrates still needed wet places, so drying climates could restrict them. Early reptiles and other amniotes, less bound to water for reproduction, found opportunities in habitats where older forms faced limits. Insects also continued to diversify, adapting to changing plant communities and terrestrial conditions. Life on land was no longer fragile in the old sense, but it was still vulnerable to climate, geography, and the changing arrangement of continents. The rise of Pangaea turned separate regions into a connected landmass on a scale the planet had not held for a long time. Connection can allow movement, but it can also create harsh interiors, stronger seasonality, and fewer sheltered coastlines relative to the vast area of land. A supercontinent is not only a map shape, it changes winds, rainfall, ocean circulation, erosion, and the distribution of habitats. As Pangaea assembled, the world that had nurtured coal forests and wetland giants began giving way to another Earth, one where survival on land increasingly favoured bodies that could endure dryness, distance, and ecological change. The Paleozoic land story had moved from small plants on damp surfaces to forests, flying insects, large arthropods, amphibian predators, and the first reptiles. It was a remarkable transformation, but it did not lead into stability. It led toward pressure. The same tectonic forces that built mountains and gathered continents were helping rearrange climate and habitat. The same forests that stored carbon and raised oxygen were part of cycles that could not remain fixed. The same amniotic egg that freed some vertebrates from water also prepared them for a world where water would become less evenly available. By the late Paleozoic, life on land had become rich enough to be deeply affected by planetary change. The continents were drawing together. The interiors were becoming more severe. The swamps that once seemed to spread with quiet confidence were beginning to lose their old continuity. A world was closing in, and the creatures moving through its forests were already living inside the first signs of the next great test. The end of the Paleozoic does not arrive as one clean disaster with a single visible edge. It gathers through pressure. By late Permian time, Pangaea has become the dominant shape of the land, an enormous supercontinent stretching across climate belts and enclosing vast interiors far from the sea. Around its margins, shallow marine habitats still hold reefs, shelled animals, fish, and many older lineages that had survived earlier crises. On land, reptiles and their relatives move through increasingly varied landscapes, while amphibian-like animals remain tied to wetter places. Plants occupy forests, floodplains, and drier regions in different forms, no longer only the swamp worlds of the Carboniferous. The planet is alive, complex, and deeply established. Yet that establishment makes the coming collapse more severe. The Permian extinction is not simply the loss of a few groups at the end of an era, it is the largest known mass extinction in the history of animal life. A narrowing of the living world so strong that the boundary between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic feels less like a normal transition than a wound in the record. The causes are still studied, but the central pressure points are clear enough to give the event its shape. Immense volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released vast amounts of lava and gases over a long interval. These eruptions, often called the Siberian traps, did not only pour molten rock across the surface, they likely disturbed the atmosphere and oceans through carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, heat, acid rain, and the release of additional greenhouse gases from surrounding rocks and sediments. The exact sequence remains difficult to untangle, because the extinction unfolded across environments that recorded the crisis in different ways, but the broad pattern points toward a planet pushed into rapid warming, chemical stress, and ecological breakdown. In the ocean, warming water holds less oxygen. If circulation weakens or stratifies, the deeper sea can lose oxygen further, producing anoxic conditions where many animals cannot survive. In some places, waters may also have become euxinic, meaning both oxygen-poor and rich in toxic dissolved sulfide. Such a sea would be dangerous not only because it lacked breathable oxygen for marine animals, but because its chemistry could poison habitats that had once supported complex life. At the same time, carbon dioxide entering the ocean could contribute to acidification, making it harder for shell-building organisms to maintain carbonate skeletons. Reefs suffered badly. Brachiopods, trilobites, many corals, and numerous other marine invertebrates declined or disappeared. The trilobites, which had crossed so much of the Paleozoic from its early seas onward, finally vanished. Their disappearance has a quiet force because they had been present near the beginning of visible animal abundance. To lose them at the end of the Paleozoic is to feel the era close not through symbolism, but through the actual removal of a lineage that had carried its shape across hundreds of millions of years. The land did not escape. The late Permian world was already shaped by the consequences of Pangaea. Huge continental interiors could become dry, seasonal, and difficult. When volcanic gases and climate change were added to that setting, habitats shifted faster than many organisms could adjust. Forests were disrupted, soils changed, rivers carried different loads, fires, droughts, heat stress, and unstable rainfall may all have affected terrestrial ecosystems. Many amphibian-like vertebrates declined, especially those still bound to wet environments. Reptile relatives, including synapsids, suffered major losses. Though some survived and would later matter greatly, insects also experienced a serious drop. One of the rare times in their long history when their diversity appears to have been sharply reduced. This is important because insects are often treated as nearly unstoppable. But the Permian crisis shows that even deeply successful groups can be struck when the systems around them fail at once. Extinction at this scale is not just death added together, it is relationship breaking. A plant community changes, and the animals that feed, shelter, or reproduce within it lose stability. A reef collapses, and the many organisms that depend on its structure lose not only food but space. Oxygen disappears from water, and animals capable of tolerating normal stress find themselves beyond their limits. Heat changes metabolism, acidification changes skeletons, drought changes rivers and floodplains. When many pressures arrive together, survival is no longer determined only by strength or size. It depends on tolerance, range, reproduction, diet, luck, and the ability to pass through a bottleneck while the world reorganizes around absence. Some organisms survived because they were adaptable. Some survived because their habitats were less damaged. Some survived for reasons that are difficult to reconstruct. The fossil record shows the result more clearly than the individual stories. Many branches end, others shrink. A few pass forward into the damaged beginning of the next era. The aftermath may have been almost as important as the extinction itself. Ecosystems did not simply refill immediately once the worst was over. Recovery after the Permian crisis took a long time, and the early Triassic world that followed was often unstable. Low diversity communities spread across broad areas. Some hardy animals became unusually common because fewer competitors and predators remained. The complexity of reefs and forests took time to return. This delay tells something essential about mass extinction. Removing species is not like clearing space in a room. It removes interactions, habits, structures, and balances that took immense time to build. A reef is not replaced the moment water becomes tolerable again. A forest is not restored the moment seeds or spores remain. Food webs do not regain depth simply because a few survivors reproduce. The living world has to rebuild its connections, and connections are slow. In that slowness, the Permian ending becomes more than a boundary line in the geologic timescale. It becomes a demonstration that Earth history is not only progressive expansion, it is also vulnerability. The Phanerozoic has already shown life becoming visible, complex, mobile, rooted, winged, and increasingly terrestrial. It has shown animals entering the sea floor, fish gaining jaws, plants greening continents, tetrapods crossing margins, insects taking to the air, and reptiles loosening their dependence on water. Yet all of that richness could still be cut down by planetary change intense enough to strike the atmosphere, oceans, and land together. The lesson is not that life is weak. Life survives the Permian, but survival is not the same as continuity. The world that comes through the crisis is not the same world that entered it. Ancient lineages vanish. Ecological roles are emptied. The future is handed to survivors that may have seemed only one part of the older order. That is how extinction changes history. It does not merely subtract from the present, it edits the future. Without the Permian collapse, the Mesozoic would not have opened in the same way. The rise of dinosaurs, the later expansion of mammals, and the structure of Triassic ecosystems all unfold in the space left by the Paleozoic ending. This does not make the extinction purposeful. It only shows how deeply contingency sits inside the story of life. A catastrophe removes many possibilities, and the few that remain begin making a different world. At the close of the Paleozoic, the old seas and forests have been reduced to fragments of their former richness. Pangaea remains. The climate remains unsettled. The oceans carry the memory of oxygen loss and chemical strain. On land, survivors move through landscapes where familiar communities have been broken. The Phanerozoic does not stop. It narrows, endures, and begins again under altered rules. The next era will be called the Age of Reptiles. But at this moment there is no age of anything yet. Only recovery beginning from a planet that has lost much of what once made it abundant. The Triassic world begins with a silence that is not empty, but thinned. After the Permian extinction, the land and sea still contain life, yet the richness that had filled the late Paleozoic has been cut back so sharply that many habitats seem to restart with only a few durable players. Pangaea remains immense, stretching across the planet as one great mass of connected land. Its coastlines are long, but its interior lies far from the steadying influence of the ocean, and that distance helps create heat, dryness, and strong seasonal contrasts. In many regions, recovery does not look like a lush return. It looks uneven, practical, and bare in places where older ecosystems once held more layers. The animals that survive do not inherit a comfortable Earth. They inherit space, but space after catastrophe is not the same as opportunity in a healthy world. It comes with unstable climate, simplified food webs, damaged soils, and oceans still carrying the after effects of chemical stress. The early Triassic is therefore one of the most important intervals in the Phanerozoic, not because it is crowded with familiar giants, but because it shows how life begins again when the web has been torn and only some threads remain. On land, some survivors became common across wide areas, not because they were destined to dominate forever, but because the world around them had lost so many competitors. Lystrosaurus, a squat, beaked synapsid related more closely to the mammal line than to reptiles, is one of the best-known examples. Its fossils appear in many parts of the early Triassic world, and that wide distribution makes it feel almost like a marker of survival itself. It was not elegant in the way later animals are sometimes imagined. It was sturdy, low, and suited to feeding on tough vegetation. Its success hints at a world where the ability to endure harsh conditions mattered more than specialized refinement. Other synapsids survived as well, though the older variety of large Paleozoic forms have been greatly reduced. This matters because the mammal story does not begin with mammals suddenly appearing in a quiet corner. It begins with a damaged lineage passing through a crisis, shrinking, changing, and continuing under pressure. The ancestors of mammals were present in the Triassic as small, active animals with increasingly refined jaws, teeth, and senses. By the later Triassic, true early mammals or very close mammal relatives appear, but they remain small beside the reptile lineages that are beginning to expand around them. Their future is still hidden in the margins. Reptiles and their relatives also move into the open spaces left by extinction. Among them, archosaurs become especially important. This group will eventually include crocodile relatives, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds. But in the early Triassic it is not yet a parade of those familiar names. It is a widening set of survivors and new forms, experimenting with posture, feeding, speed, armor, and body size. Some archosaurs remain close to the ground and heavy-bodied. Others become more upright in their stance, holding their limbs beneath the body rather than sprawling widely to the sides. That change may sound small, but it affects movement, breathing, and endurance. A more upright posture can make walking and running more efficient, and in open Triassic landscapes that efficiency may have mattered. The first dinosaurs appear later in the Triassic, at first as relatively small animals within a world still dominated by other reptiles. They do not begin as rulers. They begin as one branch among many, lightly built, often bipedal, and not yet the overwhelming presence they will become in the Jurassic. Their rise is gradual, helped by later extinctions and ecological openings. In this first Mesozoic movement, dinosaurs are still part of a larger recovery, not its obvious conclusion. The seas recover in their own uneven way. The Permian extinction had damaged marine ecosystems so deeply that early Triassic oceans often show low diversity and simple communities. Reefs, which had once supported dense networks of life, take time to rebuild. Shell-forming organisms return, but not as though nothing happened. New groups begin to gain importance, while older Paleozoic communities never fully reassemble in their former shape. Ammonoids, coiled cephalopods related to squids and octopuses, recover and diversify after passing through severe bottlenecks. Bivalves and gastropods become more prominent in many settings. Marine reptiles also begin to appear and expand, showing that vertebrates were not only reshaping land ecosystems, but also returning to the water in new ways. Some of these animals would later become highly specialized swimmers, but the early Triassic stages are part of a broader pattern after the extinction. The ocean does not simply restore the old order. It creates a different one from the survivors available. Recovery is creative, but it is creative under constraint. Plants face their own altered world. The great coal swamp forests of earlier times are gone from many regions, replaced by communities better suited to the drier and more seasonal climates of Pangaea. Seed plants, including conifers and other gymnosperms, become important across Triassic landscapes. These plants reproduce without needing free water in the same way more primitive plants do, and that helps them spread through environments where dryness is common. Their leaves, wood, seeds, and pollen become part of a changing land surface, one less dominated by wet lowland forests and more shaped by open woodland, scrub, river margins, and seasonal stress. Insects continue alongside them, though the relationships between insects and plants are still far from the flowering plant world of the later Cretaceous and Cenozoic. The Triassic plant world is not barren, but it carries a different rhythm from the Carboniferous. It is less swamp-thick in many places, more exposed, more seasonal, and more closely tied to the continental scale of Pangaea. That scale is central to the whole period. A supercontinent changes more than maps. It alters rainfall, wind, ocean circulation, migration routes, and barriers. When land is connected, animals can spread widely across continuous terrain, and this helps explain why some Triassic fossils appear across broad regions. But connection also means that inland habitats can become vast and severe. Monsoon patterns may bring strong seasonal rains to some areas, while others remain dry for long stretches. Coastlines and shallow seas do not reach into the continent in the same broken, sheltering way they might on a planet of many separated landmasses. The Triassic Earth is therefore both connected and difficult, open and restrictive. Life can move, but it must move through a world still shaped by heat, drought, and instability. The recovery from extinction is not a simple greening. It is a long negotiation with the physical reality of one enormous continent. Through this period, the living world begins to acquire new directions that will define the Mesozoic. Archosaurs diversify, early dinosaurs appear, pterosaurs eventually take vertebrate flight into the air, marine reptiles test the possibilities of returning to the sea, mammal relatives persist in smaller forms, refining traits that will matter much later. Insects continue to occupy terrestrial niches. Gymnosperm plants spread across landscapes where the older Paleozoic wetland pattern no longer controls everything. Yet the Triassic does not feel like the finished age of reptiles. It feels like an interval of sorting. Many lineages flourish briefly and then disappear. Crocodile line relatives, large amphibians, synapsids, early dinosaurs, and marine reptiles all share a world whose future is not settled. The later dominance of dinosaurs can make the Triassic seem like a prelude, but that view is too simple. For the animals living then, the Triassic was the whole world, with its own balances, dangers, and opportunities. It was not waiting to become Jurassic. It was building ecosystems from what survived the deepest collapse in Phanerozoic history. By the end of the Triassic, another extinction will again change the balance. removing many competitors and opening wider paths for dinosaurs in the Jurassic. But before that final boundary, the period stands as a long, uneven recovery from the Permian wound. Its importance lies in the way survival becomes transformation. The old Paleozoic order does not return. The new Mesozoic order does not arrive fully formed. Between them is a world of heat, distance, sparse beginnings, and persistent life, where small mammals remain almost hidden. Early dinosaurs are not yet giants, and reptiles of many kinds test the land, sea, and air. The Triassic is the sound of Earth's living systems becoming complex again, not smoothly, not quickly, but with enough endurance for a different future to take root. The Jurassic begins with a planet no longer able to hold itself in one piece. Pangaea is still vast, but the strain inside it has become visible in rift valleys, volcanic provinces, and widening breaks where the crust stretches thin. A supercontinent does not separate like a cracked shell in a single moment. It pulls apart slowly, with long troughs forming across the land, basins sinking, lava spreading, and new coastlines beginning as narrow arms of sea press inward. For life. This change is not a background detail. It alters rainfall, temperature, migration, isolation, and the shape of habitats. The Triassic had been a world of recovery on one enormous landmass, open in some directions and harsh in others. The Jurassic begins to loosen that world. The breakup of Pangaea makes geography more broken, and broken geography can make evolution more inventive. Populations that once moved across connected terrain find themselves separated by water, mountains, deserts, or distance. Coastlines lengthen, shallow seas spread into new margins. Moisture reaches places that had been more difficult during the dry interior life of the supercontinent. The climate remains generally warm, without the broad polar ice sheets that would define later cold intervals. But warmth does not mean sameness. A warmer Jurassic Earth holds regional differences, monsoon systems, coastal humidity, inland aridity, and changing plant communities. Life diversifies within that unevenness. Dinosaurs are the most visible beneficiaries of the new era, though they do not become important because the planet has chosen them in advance. They inherit a world altered by the end-Triassic extinction, which removed many competing reptile lineages and opened ecological space on land. In the Jurassic, dinosaurs expand into that space with remarkable variety. Sauropods grow into long-necked giants, their bodies becoming living bridges between ground plants and higher vegetation. Their size changes the meaning of a landscape. A herd of large sauropods does not simply occupy a forest or floodplain, it moves through it as a force, breaking plants, opening paths, compacting soil, and carrying digestion across distance. Their long necks allow feeding over broad vertical ranges, while their column-like limbs support weights no earlier land animals had approached. The details of their biology remain carefully studied, from growth rates to breathing systems to posture, but their ecological presence is clear. They made the Jurassic land feel large in a new way. Alongside them, theropod dinosaurs moved as predators, scavengers, and smaller hunters across many habitats. Some were large enough to dominate food webs, others were lighter, quicker, and more specialized. Their hollow bones and air sac breathing systems, shared in deep ancestry with birds, made their bodies different from those of heavy sprawling reptiles. Many walked on two legs with heads balanced forward and tails extended behind, a posture that gave speed and balance a central role. Predation in the Jurassic was not a single style. It included pursuit, ambush, scavenging, and the pressure of animals that shape the behavior of prey simply by existing. Herbivorous dinosaurs also diversified beyond sauropods. Stegosaurs, with plates and tail spikes, appear in Jurassic ecosystems, carrying defences that seem both strange and practical. Ornithopods remain smaller and less dominant than they would become later, but they are present as part of the widening herbivore world. The dinosaur story in the Jurassic is therefore not only a story of giants, it is a story of body plans spreading into roles that the Triassic had only begun to make available. Plants set much of the stage on which those animals lived. The Jurassic world is still a world before flowering plants become dominant. Its forests and open woodlands are shaped by conifers. Cycads, ginkgos, seed ferns, and other gymnosperms. These plants reproduce through seeds and pollen, better suited to drier air than the older spore-dependent plants that needed free water for reproduction. In some regions, conifer forests stretched across broad landscapes. Cycads and Bennettitalians gave many places a low, stiff, palm-like texture, though they were not palms. Ferns filled disturbed ground and humid understories. The plant world was not merely scenery for dinosaurs. It determined food quality, shelter, fire patterns, soil behaviour, and the distribution of herbivores. Sauropods and other plant-eating dinosaurs lived within this vegetation, cropping, browsing, digesting, and moving seeds or spores indirectly through the disturbance they caused. No grasslands existed yet. The open plains of a later world were absent. Jurassic openness came from floodplains, dry basins, coastal flats, volcanic landscapes, and patchy woodland, not from grass. This makes the era familiar only in outline. It has forests and large animals, but not the ecological texture of modern savannas or temperate woods. The seas also changed as Pangaea broke. New ocean basins opened, and shallow marine environments expanded along rifted margins. Marine reptiles occupied many of these waters, including ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs. They were not dinosaurs, though they shared the Mesozoic world and often carry the same public imagination. Ichthyosaurs had streamlined bodies suited to fast swimming, with shapes that can recall dolphins because both face similar demands in water, though their ancestry was entirely different. Plesiosaurs developed broad paddles and, in some lineages, long necks that gave them a distinctive profile unlike most marine animals before or since. Plesiosaurs, with shorter necks and massive heads, became powerful predators in Jurassic seas. Around them moved fish, ammonites, belemnites, marine crocodile relatives, and many invertebrates. The ocean was not a separate stage from the land story. Rift seas, coastlines, and shallow shelves formed because the continents were pulling apart. Tectonics shaped the water, and the water shaped the life within it. Ammonites, coiled cephalopods with chambered shells, are especially important in Jurassic rocks because they evolved quickly and spread widely, allowing geologists to compare the ages of distant marine sediments. Their shells, often ribbed or ornamented, are not only beautiful fossils, they are time markers, signs of a world where marine life changed fast enough to become a measuring tool for deep time. Above land and water, another branch of reptiles used the air. Pterosaurs had already appeared in the Triassic, but the Jurassic sees them become more varied. They were the first vertebrates to evolve powered flight, with wings formed from skin and muscle, stretched along an elongated finger. Their bodies were light, their bones thin-walled, and their habits diverse. Some likely skimmed or hunted near water, others moved through coastal or inland environments. They were not birds, and their flight was built on a different anatomical solution. But they made the Mesozoic sky a living space long before birds became common. Birds themselves begin within the dinosaur line during the Jurassic, or very near it, with Archaeopteryx often standing as a famous early example of a feathered animal combining bird-like and dinosaur-like traits. Feathers didn't begin simply as tools for flight. They likely had earlier roles in insulation, display, or brooding, before some lineages used them in gliding and powered movement. This matters because it shows again how major transitions are assembled from traits that first serve other purposes. The air, like the land and sea, was becoming more inhabited through gradual additions rather than sudden replacement. Mammals remained small during the Jurassic, but small does not mean unimportant. Early mammals and close relatives lived in the shadow of dinosaurs, yet that phrase can be misleading if it makes them seem passive. They occupied nocturnal, burrowing, climbing, insect-eating, and possibly gliding niches in some cases. Their teeth became more specialized. Their jaws and ears continued refinements that had begun in synapsid ancestry. Their warm-bloodedness, hair, and parental care gave them ways of living that did not require large size. They were not waiting idly for the dinosaurs to disappear. They were evolving steadily within the spaces available, surviving in a world where being small, hidden, and flexible could be a strength. The Jurassic therefore contains several futures at once. Giant dinosaurs dominate many landscapes. Pterosaurs move through the air. Marine reptiles patrol the seas. Early birds begin near the edges of flight. Mammals persist in small bodies with finely tuned senses. Plants create forests without flowers. Continents split apart. And each widening gap makes the map less unified than before. By the late Jurassic, the old wholeness of Pangaea is fading into a new pattern of northern and southern land masses, separated by growing seas and regional histories. Isolation begins to matter more. Evolution takes on more local accents. The same broad groups may be present across the world, but their forms and communities start to differ as geography pulls them apart. This is the deeper meaning of Jurassic expansion. It is not only that dinosaurs grow larger or more numerous, it is that life expands into a planet whose physical structure is opening, separating, and offering new edges. The supercontinent that once gathered the late Paleozoic world into one severe landmass is losing its grip. In the cracks, margins, coasts, forests, and new seas, the Mesozoic becomes fuller. The next period will bring flowering plants, new insect partnerships, greater dinosaur variety, and the slow approach of another boundary. But in the Jurassic, the central movement is release. Continents begin to part, and life, no longer confined to the older shape of Pangaea, spreads into the widening spaces. The Cretaceous world does not begin by replacing the Jurassic all at once. It inherits its forests, its dinosaurs, its marine reptiles, its pterosaurs, and its widening continents, then slowly rearranges them until the planet feels different in nearly every layer of life. The breakup of Pangaea continues. Seas rise and spread across low continental interiors. Warm climates reach high latitudes, where forests can grow in places that would later become cold and seasonal. The map becomes more divided, with northern and southern lands following separate histories as ocean basins widen between them. In that separation, dinosaur communities take on regional character. Some lineages flourish in one part of the world and remain absent or rare in another. Coastlines advance and retreat, leaving broad, shallow seas where marine life moves above drowned plains. The land is still a Mesozoic land, still without grasses in the familiar sense for much of the period, still dominated in many places by conifers, cycads, ferns, and other seed plants older than flowers. Yet within this inherited world, a quieter botanical change begins to spread. Flowering plants appear, first modestly, then with increasing force, and their arrival will alter not only landscapes but the relationships among plants, insects, and animals. A flower is not just a soft ornament added to a green world. It is a reproductive structure, a way of packaging attraction, pollen transfer, seed formation, and later fruit into an efficient system of reproduction. Early flowering plants, or angiosperms, were probably small parts of many landscapes before they became dominant. They grew in disturbed ground, river margins, open patches, and places where fast life cycles could matter. Their success did not come from beauty alone. It came from speed, flexibility, enclosed seeds, and new partnerships with animals, especially insects. Pollination by wind had long existed among other plants, and many flowering plants would still use wind, but animal pollination created a different kind of exchange. An insect searching for food could carry pollen from one plant to another. A plant that offered nectar, scent, colour, or accessible pollen could increase its chances of reproduction. This did not happen as a single invention made whole overnight. It developed through many forms and many relationships, some loose, some increasingly specialised. The result was a new ecological conversation, one that brought plant reproduction and insect behaviour into closer contact than ever before. Insects had already been on land for a very long time, but flowering plants gave many of them new opportunities. Beetles, flies, wasps, bees, butterflies, and moths would all become tied in different ways to the angiosperm world, though their major histories did not unfold at the same pace. Some fed on pollen or nectar, some laid eggs on leaves or stems, some chewed, bored, sucked, or carried pollen without intending anything beyond their own survival. Plants answered with chemical defences, tougher tissues, timing, scent, shape, and reward. This is one reason the Cretaceous feels so important beyond the obvious grandeur of dinosaurs. A new kind of intimacy appears in ecosystems. The life of a plant becomes linked to the movement of small animals in the air. Reproduction begins to depend, in many cases, on visitation. Food webs become denser not only through large predators and prey, but through tiny repeated acts at the level of flowers, leaves, and insect bodies. The later world of orchards, forests, meadows, and flowering shrubs begins here, not as a finished scene, but as a set of relationships spreading through Mesozoic landscapes that still look unfamiliar in almost every other way. Dinosaurs continue to diversify as this botanical change unfolds. In the early Cretaceous, many Jurassic lineages remain important, but new forms become increasingly prominent. Sauropods persist, especially in southern continents, where titanosaurs become some of the great long-necked herbivores of the period. Their bodies could be enormous, yet their success was not only a matter of size. They occupied feeding roles across broad landscapes, laying eggs in nests and moving through floodplains, woodlands, and open habitats shaped by climate and vegetation. In northern regions, other herbivores become increasingly important. Iguanodontians and later duck-billed dinosaurs develop powerful chewing systems that allow them to process plant matter more efficiently than many earlier herbivores. Ceratopsians, with beaks, frills, and horns in later forms, become major animals in some late Cretaceous ecosystems. Armoured ankylosaurs carry heavy protection across the ground, built low and solid, with bony plates and, in some lineages, tail clubs. These animals make clear that herbivory is not passive. To eat plants in a world of large predators requires jaws, guts, defences, herd behaviour in some cases, and constant negotiation with the vegetation available. The plant eater is not merely food for something else. It is a large engine of digestion, movement, and landscape pressure. Predatory dinosaurs change as well. Allosaur relatives remain important in some earlier Cretaceous settings, but later tyrannosaurs rise in parts of the northern continents. Tyrannosaurus rex belongs only to the very end of the period. a late arrival rather than a symbol of all dinosaur time. Its immense skull, crushing bite, strong hind limbs, and reduced forelimbs make it one of the most studied predators in Earth history, but it stands on top of a long and changing predatory tradition. Elsewhere, abelisaurids, carcharodontosaurids, dromaeosaurs, and other theropods filled different roles. Some were large apex predators, some were small, feathered hunters. Some may have climbed, leapt, brooded eggs, or used plumage for display and insulation. Feathers, once treated mainly as a bird feature, are now understood as part of a broader dinosaur story. They reveal that the boundary between bird and dinosaur is not a sharp wall. Birds are one surviving branch of theropod dinosaurs, and the Cretaceous sky and trees held many early birds and bird-like animals whose forms were still varied and experimental. Some had teeth, some had clawed wings, some were strong flyers, some remained tied to shores, forests, or lakes. The air was shared with pterosaurs, which also reached remarkable variety. Some were small and delicate. Others, especially late in the Cretaceous, became among the largest flying animals ever known. Their wings were built differently from those of birds, supported by an elongated finger rather than feathered arms, and their success shows that flight can be solved through more than one anatomical path. For much of the Mesozoic, pterosaurs were the great vertebrate flyers. Birds did not simply replace them immediately. They expanded alongside them, taking some roles while pterosaurs retained others, above Cretaceous coasts, forests, and inland waters. The sky held multiple experiments in flight, each with its own structure and history. In the oceans, the warm high seas of the Cretaceous supported ammonites, fish, sharks, marine reptiles, and plankton whose tiny mineral remains would later help form chalk and other sediments. The Western Interior Seaway, which spread across what is now North America, divided land into eastern and western regions, and filled the middle of the continent with marine life. Mosasaurs rose late in the period as powerful marine lizards, while plesiosaurs continued in varied forms. Ichthyosaurs, so successful earlier in the Mesozoic, declined and disappeared before the final extinction. The seas were rich, but not static. They were shaped by high sea level, warm water, changing oxygen conditions, and the continual opening of oceans between drifting continents. On land and sea alike, the Cretaceous was a time of abundance mixed with instability. Volcanism, climate shifts, ocean chemistry, and sea level changes all moved through the background. Life was flourishing, but flourishing does not mean protected. That is one of the deeper lessons of the later Mesozoic. The world before the final boundary was not weak or empty, it was full. Forests were changing as flowering plants spread. Insects were entering new partnerships. Dinosaurs had reached extraordinary variety. Birds were refining flight. Pterosaurs still crossed the air. Mammals remained mostly small, but they were diversifying beneath, around, and sometimes within the dinosaur-dominated ecosystems. Some climbed, some burrowed, some ate insects, plants, or small animals. Their bodies continued to carry the quiet refinements of warm blood, hair, sensitive hearing, and complex teeth. They were present, alert, and evolving, though not yet the large land animals of the next era. The Cretaceous closes in the mind so often with impact and extinction that the living world before that moment can be flattened into a waiting room for disaster. It was not. It was an intricate Earth, regional, warm, restless, and highly productive, with old lineages and new partnerships overlapping in a map still being rewritten by plate tectonics. The first flowers did not know they were altering the future of terrestrial life. Birds did not know they were the dinosaur branch that would pass through the coming darkness. Mammals did not know their smallness would soon become an opening. The late Mesozoic world was not preparing itself for an ending. It was living at full complexity. And that is what makes the next boundary so severe. The catastrophe did not strike a fading age. It struck a planet still crowded with successful forms. The last day of the Mesozoic was not recognized by the animals living inside it. Forests still held insects, birds, small mammals, lizards, snakes, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Rivers still crossed floodplains. Ammonites still moved through warm seas. Flowering plants were spreading through disturbed ground and woodland edges. In the shallow waters of what is now the Gulf of Mexico, carbonate platforms and marine life continued under sunlight as they had through ordinary days of the late Cretaceous. Then an asteroid, probably roughly 10 kilometers wide, struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact site is known as Chicxulub, and its scale is difficult to hold in ordinary terms. The object arrived at enormous speed, releasing energy far beyond any volcanic eruption or earthquake known to human experience. Rock was compressed, melted, vaporized, and thrown outward. A crater more than 100 kilometers across was carved into the crust. Seawater flashed into steam. Sulfur-rich rocks and carbonate sediments were blasted into the atmosphere. Near the impact zone, heat, wind, earthquakes, and waves turned the boundary between land and sea into violence almost beyond reconstruction. But the deeper importance of Chicxulub lies not only in what happened nearby. It lies in how quickly a local strike became a planetary event. Material thrown into the atmosphere spread around the globe. Tiny particles, soot, dust, and aerosols darkened the sky. Sunlight reaching the surface was reduced, photosynthesis faltered, temperatures shifted sharply. Food webs that depended on green plants and plankton began to break from the base upward. The event did not simply kill by force, it changed the working conditions of life. A large animal could survive the first blast if it lived far away, yet still face a world in which food became scarce. Seasons lost their older rhythm, and ecosystems no longer supported the same bodies. This is why the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was both sudden and uneven. Some organisms disappeared almost everywhere. Others passed through in reduced numbers. Some environments were struck more directly than others. The boundary in the rocks records a thin layer enriched in iridium, an element rare at Earth's surface but more common in certain extraterrestrial materials. That layer, found in many parts of the world, helped reveal that the extinction was tied to something beyond normal gradual change. Shocked minerals, tiny glassy droplets formed from melted rock, and the buried crater itself strengthened the case. The evidence is now strong that the impact was central to the extinction, though it occurred on a planet already shaped by other stresses. Large volcanic eruptions in the Deccan Traps of what is now India were also releasing gases and lava around this time, affecting climate and atmospheric chemistry. The late Cretaceous was not a perfectly stable world waiting passively for one object from space. It was already dynamic, but the impact gave that restless planet a sharp boundary, a fast global blow that many lineages could not absorb. In the oceans, the crisis moved through food webs with particular force. Plankton, the tiny drifting organisms that support much marine life, were vulnerable to darkness and chemical change. When their productivity fell, animals higher in the chain lost support. Ammonites, which had been part of marine ecosystems since far earlier in the Mesozoic, vanished. Many marine reptiles were already gone or declining before the boundary, but mosasaurs and plesiosaurs also disappeared by the end. Large predatory fish, sharks, bivalves, and many other groups were affected in different ways. Some survived, but the composition of the sea changed. The loss was not just a list of names, it was the removal of long-standing ways of living, including forms that had once seemed as characteristic of the Mesozoic ocean as dinosaurs were of the land. On land, the most famous disappearance is that of the non-avian dinosaurs. They had been present for more than 160 million years, adapting through continental breakup, climate shifts, changing plants, and evolving predators. Their extinction was not the fading of a weak group. It was the abrupt removal of successful animals that had filled herbivore and predator roles across many continents. Large size, which had been useful in stable ecosystems, may have become a liability when food chains collapsed. Animals needing large amounts of plant matter or large prey would have faced a world suddenly unable to feed them. Eggs and young may have suffered as habitats changed. Some dinosaurs may have lasted briefly in certain regions, but the broad pattern is clear. The only dinosaur lineage to cross the boundary was the bird line. Birds were not outside the dinosaur story. They were part of it. Small feathered descendants of theropods whose bodies carried flight, warm blood, and flexible diets into the crisis. Even birds suffered losses. Many ancient bird groups disappeared. The survivors were only a portion of what had existed before, but that portion would eventually diversify into the birds of the Cenozoic. The difference between extinction and survival could be narrow: size, diet, habitat, reproduction, sheltering behavior, and chance all mattered. Small mammals also passed through the boundary, though not unharmed. Their survival may have been helped by traits that had long kept them in the margins of dinosaur-dominated worlds. Many were small enough to need less food. Some could burrow or shelter. Some ate insects, seeds, roots, or a broad mix of available resources. A flexible diet is valuable when specialized food sources disappear. Nocturnal habits and insulated bodies may have helped in dark, cooler intervals after the impact, but mammals did not win because they were somehow waiting with a superior plan. They survived because some lineages happened to carry combinations of traits that worked in a broken world. Afterward, those traits became the beginning of a much larger expansion. The same is true for many other survivors: crocodilians, turtles, lizards, snakes, frogs, salamanders, fishes, insects, flowering plants, ferns, and many marine invertebrates crossed the boundary in different ways. Freshwater habitats may have offered some protection because they relied more heavily on detritus, dead organic matter, than on immediate photosynthesis alone. Burrows, seeds, spores, dormant stages, and life cycles tied to sheltered places could all help organisms endure temporary darkness and scarcity. Survival was not evenly distributed, and it was never guaranteed. It was a matter of passing through a short interval of extreme stress, and then finding a place in the unsettled world that followed. The first landscapes after the impact were not instantly renewed. In many places, ferns appear abundantly in the fossil record soon after the boundary, a pattern sometimes called a fern spike. Ferns are good colonizers of disturbed ground, and their spores can spread widely. Their rise suggests landscapes opened by fire, death, and damage, where fast-growing plants could cover exposed soil before more complex forest returned. Flowering plants survived and continued their long expansion, but individual forests and plant communities were disrupted. Insects tied to particular plants may have suffered when those plants declined. Herbivores lost food, predators lost prey. The extinction therefore moved outward through connections. A branch falling from the living world brought other branches with it. What remained was not emptiness, but simplification. The early Cenozoic would build from that simplification, slowly adding new complexity from surviving stocks. This boundary has a special place in deep time because its cores connect Earth to the wider solar system so directly. For most of the Phanerozoic, changes in life are linked to climate, sea level, tectonics, oxygen, volcanism, evolution, and ecological pressure. Here, all of that earthbound history meets the path of an object moving through space. The asteroid did not create vulnerability from nothing, but it struck with enough force to redirect the future of life. Without it, non-avian dinosaurs might have continued for millions of years longer. Mammals might have remained smaller and less dominant. Birds, flowering plants, and insects would still have evolved, but in a different world. The point is not that one impact explains everything before or after it. The point is that contingency can be immense. A body from beyond Earth arrived at a particular place, at a particular time, into rocks whose chemistry helped worsen the global aftermath. That combination changed the history of the planet. At the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the Mesozoic closes not because life has run out of invention, but because a thriving world is interrupted. The dinosaurs disappear except for birds, ammonites vanish from the seas, pterosaurs leave the air, marine reptiles are gone, mammals, birds, flowering plants, insects, and many smaller survivors remain, carrying fragments of the older world into a new one. The next era will look more familiar in outline, but it begins under the shadow of absence. The Cenozoic is not born from a clean beginning. It rises from a cleared and damaged Earth, where survival has become the raw material for a different age. The first Cenozoic landscapes carried the marks of loss before they carried the shape of renewal. After the impact at the end of the Cretaceous, forests did return, animals did breed, rivers did keep cutting their channels, and the sea did not remain empty. But the world had been simplified. Whole forms of life that had once defined the Mesozoic were gone, and the survivors moved through spaces that had recently been occupied by very different bodies. In that early Paleogene world, mammals begin to matter in a new way. They had already existed for a long time, living beside dinosaurs through much of the Mesozoic, mostly small, often hidden, and more varied than older stories allowed. Some climbed, some dug, some ate insects, seeds, fruit, or small animals. Some had already developed sharp senses, warm bodies, hair, and complex teeth. The extinction didn't invent them. It changed the world around them. With non-avian dinosaurs gone from land ecosystems, many large herbivore and predator roles stood open. Mammals did not fill those roles immediately, and they did not expand as a single wave of triumph. Their rise was uneven, local, and shaped by climate, plants, competition, and geography. Small surviving lineages began to diversify into bodies that browsed, ran, swam, climbed, glided, and hunted. The familiar age of mammals began quietly, with animals testing the new outline of a damaged planet. At first, many mammals remained modest in size. A broken food web does not instantly support giants. Forests needed time to recover. Plant communities were changing. Predators and prey had to build new relationships. In the early Paleocene, some mammals still looked unspecialized, with generalized teeth and bodies suited to flexible diets. That flexibility was valuable. A world recovering from extinction favors animals that can take what is available rather than depend on one narrow source. Over time, however, specialization returned. Hoofed mammals began to explore plant eating in different forms. Early primates or primate relatives moved through trees, using grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and flexible bodies in forested habitats. Carnivorous mammals developed sharper teeth and hunting adaptations. Some mammals moved toward the water, where the long future of whales would begin from land-dwelling ancestors that spent more time in rivers, coasts, and shallow seas. Bats eventually took mammalian flight into the night air, joining birds and insects in a sky that had lost pterosaurs but not the possibility of wings. Each of these transformations depended on ordinary pressures finding food, avoiding danger, raising young, surviving seasons, and moving through the geography at hand. The Cenozoic was not simply a stage cleared for mammals. It was a planet full of survivors, and mammals became important because some of their inherited traits suited the rebuilding world especially well. Birds also expanded after the extinction, and their presence keeps the Cenozoic from being too narrowly named. The only surviving dinosaurs did not remain as a small leftover branch. They became cranes, ducks, owls, songbirds, penguins, parrots, vultures, and countless other forms over time. Some early Cenozoic birds were large ground dwellers, able to dominate certain predator roles in regions where mammalian carnivores had not yet become established. Others refined flight, diving, perching, migration, and specialized feeding. The sky after the Mesozoic was not empty. It was being repopulated by feathered dinosaurs that had crossed the boundary in reduced form and then multiplied in the new era. Flowering plants continued their spread as well, deepening the ecological world that had begun in the Cretaceous. Forests rich in angiosperms offered fruits, seeds, nectar, leaves, and wood to animals and insects. Pollination networks became more intricate. Insects diversified with flowers, leaves, bark, and soil. Mammals and birds fed on fruits and seeds, sometimes carrying them across landscapes. The Cenozoic therefore became familiar not because mammals alone grew more visible, but because many parts of the modern living world began to take recognizable relationships: flowering plants with pollinators, fruit with seed dispersers, predators with fast herbivores, forests with climbing animals, coasts with seabirds and marine mammals. Beneath this biological renewal, the continents kept moving. The Cretaceous breakup had already separated major land masses, but the Cenozoic carried them closer to the arrangement known today. The Atlantic Ocean widened as the Americas and the Africa-Europe region continued to move apart. India, once isolated in the southern world, travelled north and collided with Asia. That collision raised the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, changing not only the map but the behaviour of climate across a vast part of the planet. Africa drifted toward Europe, helping close parts of the ancient Tethys Sea and contributing to mountain building around the Mediterranean region, including the Alps. Australia separated from Antarctica and moved northward, isolating Southern Ocean circulation in ways that would matter for global cooling. South America remained isolated for much of the early Cenozoic, allowing unusual mammals and large flightless birds to evolve along their own paths before later connection with North America changed the balance. These movements were slow beyond ordinary perception, but life felt them through isolation, migration, climate, and habitat. A continent drifting alone becomes an evolutionary island at immense scale. A land bridge forming between continents becomes a corridor for animals, plants, predators, diseases, and competition. The modern map is therefore not just a shape inherited from geology. It is a history of openings and closures that directed the movement of life. Climate in the early Cenozoic was often warmer than today. During some intervals, forests reached into high latitudes, and polar regions were far less icy than they would become later. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a brief but intense warming event by geological standards, disturbed oceans and land ecosystems as large amounts of carbon entered the atmosphere and seas. It did not resemble modern human-driven change in every cause or rate, but it shows how sensitive Earth systems can be when carbon moves rapidly into the climate system. Mammals responded with migrations, dwarfing in some lineages and shifts in distribution. Plants moved with changing temperature and rainfall. Ocean chemistry changed as carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater. Later, the long Cenozoic trend bent toward cooling. Antarctica became increasingly isolated by ocean currents, and ice sheets began to grow there. The planet that had once supported warm polar forests slowly moved toward a world with permanent ice. This cooling did not happen smoothly, and warm intervals interrupted it, but the direction mattered. It reshaped vegetation, sea level, ocean circulation, and the opportunities available to animals on land. The first half of the Cenozoic, then, is a story of recovery becoming differentiation. Mammals radiate into many forms, but their paths differ from continent to continent. On isolated islands and continents, evolution produces strange experiments. In connected regions, competition and migration produce other patterns. Early horses begin as small forest animals, before later descendants adapt to more open country. Elephants trace their ancestry through earlier proboscideans, some living in wetlands or forests before later giants spread widely. Whales pass through one of the most striking transitions of the era. From hoofed land mammals to fully aquatic animals whose bodies become streamlined, whose hind limbs shrink, and whose nostrils shift toward the top of the head. Primates diversify in trees, carrying forward vision, grasping, social behavior, and flexible feeding. Carnivorous mammals sharpen into cats, dogs, bears, hyenas, seals, and many extinct branches. None of these lines was guaranteed. They grew through repeated adjustment to climate, vegetation, geography, and other animals. The Cenozoic feels familiar because many of the actors have living relatives, but its early forms were often odd, provisional, and unlike their descendants in detail. A viewer from the present would recognize that the world was becoming mammalian, but not yet that it was becoming modern. The outlines were there, still soft, still changing. By the middle and later Cenozoic, continents, climates, and ecosystems had built a new kind of planet from the survivors of the impact. The old Mesozoic dominance was gone. In its place stood forests of flowering plants, spreading birds, diversifying mammals, insects woven into plant reproduction, and oceans where whales and modern sharks moved through food webs no ammonite would ever enter again. Yet this new world remained rooted in deep time rather than separate from it. Mammals rose because the asteroid boundary opened space, but also because their ancestors had already endured the Mesozoic. Birds flourished because one dinosaur branch survived. Flowering plants expanded from a Cretaceous beginning. Continents created roots and barriers because plate tectonics never stopped. The Cenozoic begins to look familiar only when all these older histories overlap. It is not a clean replacement of the past. It is the past rearranged, with some lineages missing, some newly enlarged, and others quietly continuing under a sky that had changed its cast of wings. The later Cenozoic is shaped by height and cold as much as by animals. Mountains rise slowly enough that no single generation sees the full change, yet their influence spreads through air, water, and life with great force. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau grow from the long collision of India with Asia, lifting rock into thinner air and helping redirect winds across a vast part of the planet. The Alps, the Rockies, the Andes, and other ranges take form through their own histories of compression, uplift, volcanism, and erosion. Each range is different, but all mountains share one quiet power. They interfere with the movement of the atmosphere. Air climbing a slope cools, releases moisture, and leaves rain or snow on one side while the other side may lie in shadow and dryness. Rivers begin in high places and carry broken rock downward. Glaciers carve valleys where cold is strong enough. Sediment moves from peaks to basins, from basins to deltas, and from deltas to the sea. A mountain range is therefore not only a wall of stone, it is a climate machine, a water tower, a source of soil, and a divider of living worlds. In the Cenozoic, as mountains grew and continents moved into more modern positions, the planet continued its long drift toward cooler conditions. This cooling was not a smooth slide. Warm intervals interrupted it. Forests shifted north and south, seas rose and fell, and ecosystems reorganized in different regions at different times. But the larger direction was unmistakable. Antarctica became isolated enough for cold ocean currents to circle it more effectively, and ice expanded across the southern continent. Later, ice would also grow across Greenland and the high northern lands. The Earth was not returning to some earlier simple state. It was becoming a new kind of world, one with flowering plants and mammals, with birds filling the air, with whales in the oceans, and with permanent ice writing itself into the climate system. That ice changed sea level, ocean circulation, wind, rainfall, and the habitats available on land. It also changed the pace of ecological change. A warm world can be unstable, but an icehouse world adds another rhythm, advance and retreat, exposure and flooding, connection and isolation. As water becomes locked into ice sheets, sea level falls and continental shelves emerge. When ice melts, seas return and drown the low ground again. Over many cycles, this breathing of water opens and closes routes for animals and plants. Land bridges appear, then vanish. Coastlines move across the map. Islands become connected to continents, then separated again. Evolution follows these shifting paths, sometimes crossing when a route is open, sometimes differentiating when it closes. Grasslands become one of the defining habitats of this changing Cenozoic Earth. Grasses had appeared earlier, but they spread widely later as climates cooled, seasons sharpened, and many regions became more open and drier. A grassland is not just a forest with fewer trees. It is an ecosystem built around plants that grow from low points near the ground, allowing them to recover after grazing, fire, and drought. Their leaves can be tough, their silica-rich tissues hard on teeth, and their growth closely tied to rainfall and season. As grasses spread, they changed the animals that fed on them. Mammals adapted with higher crown teeth, more complex chewing, longer limbs, and digestive systems suited to abrasive, fibrous food. Horses, which had begun as smaller forest browsers, became in some lineages faster runners of open country with teeth better suited to grazing. Ruminants, including relatives of antelope, cattle, deer, and sheep, developed stomach systems that allowed microbial partners to break down plant material. Elephants and their relatives moved through forests, woodlands, and open habitats with bodies that could process huge quantities of vegetation. Rhinoceroses, camels, rodents, rabbits, and many other herbivores followed different paths through the new plant world. The expansion of grass did not erase forests, but it added a broad new theatre where speed, endurance, herding, grazing, and long sight lines mattered more than they had under closed canopy. Predators changed with them. Open habitats favoured different hunting problems. A forest predator can use trunks, shadows, and short bursts of movement. A grassland predator often faces distance, visibility, and prey built for running: cats, dogs, hyenas, bears, and many extinct carnivores diversified through these changing landscapes. Saber-toothed cats and other specialized predators show that mammalian carnivory was not one simple design. Some relied on speed, some on strength, some on group behaviour, some on ambush, and some on killing methods that left no exact modern equivalent. The grassland world was not peaceful openness. It was an ecosystem of watchfulness, movement, and repeated pressure between plants, grazers, and hunters. Even the soil changed, because grass roots can form dense underground networks that store carbon and help build deep, dark, fertile ground. Fire also became more important in many open ecosystems, recycling nutrients, preventing some trees from returning, and favouring plants able to regrow after burning. In this way, grasslands became self-reinforcing in places where climate, grazing, and fire worked together. The rise of open habitats also mattered for primates, though the human story belongs mostly to the next movement. In Africa, forests and woodlands shifted with climate, and some ape lineages lived in mosaics of trees, open ground, river margins, and seasonal habitats. These were not simple stages replacing one another, but patchworks. A landscape could hold woodland, grass, wetland, and gallery forest along rivers. Such patchiness matters because animals moving through it need flexibility. Later hominins would emerge in these varied settings, not from a single open plain, but from changing environments where food, shelter, and movement demanded adjustment. For now, the larger story remains planetary. Mountain building, cooling, and grassland expansion were creating the conditions in which many later mammal histories would unfold. The Ice Ages brought that transformation into sharper rhythm. During the Pleistocene, large ice sheets spread across northern North America and Eurasia, while mountain glaciers expanded in many ranges. These ice sheets were not merely frozen blankets. They were moving bodies of ice, grinding bedrock, carrying stones, carving basins, damming rivers, and reshaping drainage systems. Their weight depressed the crust beneath them. Their meltwater fed immense rivers and lakes. Their margins created cold, windy environments where dust could accumulate as loess, building fertile soils downwind. Beyond the ice, steppe tundra, boreal forest, temperate woodland, desert, and grassland shifted repeatedly as climates oscillated. Animals followed the moving habitats when they could. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, bison, reindeer, musk oxen, giant deer, ground sloths, camels, and many predators occupied different parts of this late Cenozoic world, not all together everywhere, but as members of regional communities shaped by cold, dryness, vegetation, and migration routes. The Ice Age world is often imagined as simply frozen, but much of its life depended on dry, open, productive landscapes near or beyond ice margins. Cold did not mean lifelessness. It meant a different arrangement of water, plants, wind, and animals. Sea level fell during glacial maxima, exposing continental shelves and creating corridors such as the Bering Land Bridge between Asia and North America. Such corridors allowed animals, plants, and eventually humans to move between continents. When climates warmed, rising seas closed these passages again. The repeated opening and closing of routes made the late Cenozoic highly dynamic. A species could expand widely during one interval and become isolated during another. Populations could meet, mix, or disappear as habitats shifted faster than forests or grasslands could always follow. Extinction became part of this rhythm, especially near the end of the Pleistocene, when climate change and human expansion would together affect many large animals. But that final pressure belongs to the edge of the next section. Here the main pattern is the making of the modern physical stage, the familiar Earth, with high mountain chains, polar ice, large grasslands, migrating herds, and climates that swing between warmer and colder states, is a late creation in the Phanerozoic. It is easy to treat mountains and ice as scenery around the animals, but they are active forces in the story. Mountains alter winds and rainfall. Ice changes sea level and connects continents by lowering the oceans. Grasslands rebuild food webs from the soil upward. Together they turn the Cenozoic into an era of movement across open ground, adaptation to abrasive plants, survival through climatic pulses, and repeated reorganization at continental scale. The planet is now much closer to the one known from the present, but its familiarity is deceptive. It is still restless, still unfinished, still carrying animals and plants through changes large enough to redirect evolution. By the end of this movement, the stage is set for a very recent arrival. One branch of primates entering a world already shaped by mountains, grass, ice, and the long memory of everything that came before. The human story begins so late in the Phanerozoic that it can seem almost misplaced beside the vastness that came before it. By the time apes and humans appear, the Cambrian seas are no longer merely ancient. They are the beginning of a record that has already passed through forests, coal swamps, reptiles, dinosaurs, flowers, mammals, mountains, grasslands, and ice. The continents have approached their modern positions. The Atlantic has widened, India has pressed into Asia, and Antarctica is locked beneath ice. Grasslands stretch through many regions, forests remain in others, and climates shift under the pulse of glacial and interglacial cycles. Humans do not enter a young world. They enter a planet layered with consequences. The air has been shaped by plants, the soil has been built by roots, microbes, fungi, animals, fire, and weathering. The oceans carry the chemistry of long biological exchange. The mammals among which early humans evolve are survivors of an asteroid boundary and descendants of small Mesozoic lineages that endured beneath larger animals. Even the primate body carries older stories, hands shaped for grasping, eyes suited for judging distance, flexible shoulders from life in trees, teeth and senses adjusted through changing diets and habitats. Nothing about the human arrival stands outside deep time. It is made from deep time, assembled from older structures under newer pressures. The ape lineage had already diversified through forests and woodland mosaics before hominins. The branch, closer to humans than to chimpanzees, began to appear in Africa. These early hominins did not emerge from a single simple backdrop of open grassland. The evidence points instead to varied environments: woodland, patches of forest, grass, wetlands, river margins, and seasonal landscapes shifting with climate. Such places reward flexibility. Food changes through the year. Water may be nearby in one season and harder to find in another. Trees offer refuge and fruit, while more open ground offers different foods and different dangers. In this patchwork, walking upright becomes one of the defining features of the human line, though it did not instantly produce the modern human form. Bipedal walking, movement on two legs, appears before large brains and long before stone tools become highly refined. It may have helped with travel, carrying, feeding posture, heat management, or movement through mixed habitats. But no single explanation is likely to contain the whole story. Like many major transitions, it probably had several advantages in different circumstances. The earliest upright walkers were not humans in the familiar sense. They were small-brained primates with bodies still carrying ties to climbing, balancing between ground and trees, old habits and new demands. The later growth of the human brain was also gradual, uneven, and costly. Brain tissue uses a large amount of energy, so larger brains are not automatically favoured unless they help survival and reproduction, enough to justify that expense. In the human lineage, brain expansion was tied to many pressures that are difficult to separate changing diets. Social life, tool use, cooperation, memory, learning, communication, and the ability to respond to unstable environments. Stone tools appear as one of the clearest traces of behavior, because stone preserves where wood, fiber, skin, and many softer materials usually disappear. A flake struck from a core can carry the pattern of intention. It shows that a hand held one stone against another, that force was directed, that an edge was made. At first, such tools are simple compared with later technologies, but their importance is not small. They record a mind working through material, not only using what the landscape offered but altering it for a task. Cutting meat, breaking bones, processing plants, scraping hides or shaping other materials all become easier with sharp stone. Toolmaking links anatomy, perception, memory, and culture, because a useful method can be learned, repeated, and passed across generations. Fire adds another transformation, though its earliest control is difficult to trace with certainty. Natural fire is older than humans by hundreds of millions of years, shaped by lightning, dry vegetation, and oxygen-rich air. The controlled use of fire by human ancestors changed the terms of life. Fire gives heat, protection, light after sunset, and access to cooked food. Cooking can make some foods safer and easier to digest, changing how energy is drawn from the environment. Around fire, time itself becomes reorganized. Darkness no longer ends activity in the same way. Social attention can gather in one place, yet the archaeological record of early fire is patchy, and caution is needed. Some burnt material comes from natural events. Some may reflect brief use rather than full control. What matters for the broader Phanerozoic story is that one animal eventually learned to handle a planetary process that had once belonged only to weather, vegetation, and chance. Fire, like stone tools, shows humans beginning to change not just their behavior but the conditions around them. During the Pleistocene, several human relatives shared the world, including Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and others at different times and places. Human evolution was not a single straight line leading neatly to the present. It was a branching history, with populations spreading, separating, adapting, mixing, and disappearing. They hunted, gathered, made tools, used shelters, cared for young, and endured climate swings that repeatedly rearranged habitats. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa and later spread widely beyond it, meeting and sometimes interbreeding with other human groups. That expansion happened in a world still shaped by Ice Age rhythms. Lower sea levels exposed land bridges, deserts expanded and contracted, forests shifted, herds moved, coasts changed as water advanced and retreated. The routes humans took were not open in all times equally. Geography breathed with climate, and migration followed that breathing. Human beings entered Australia, Eurasia, the Americas, and many islands through combinations of movement, skill, timing, and environmental opportunity. As modern humans spread, they carried a new intensity of culture. Tools became more varied. Clothing, shelters, ornaments, art, long-distance exchange, boats, and complex social traditions appear in different forms across different regions. Language, though it leaves no direct fossil, must have become central to cooperation, memory, teaching, and shared meaning. This cultural inheritance changed evolution's pace. Genetic change still mattered, but learned behavior could alter survival within a single lifetime and be transmitted without waiting for anatomy to change. A group could adapt to cold with clothing and shelter. It could adapt to new foods with tools, cross water, track seasons, and remember landscapes through practice. culture did not remove humans from nature. It became one of the ways nature operated through humans. The late Pleistocene also saw the decline and disappearance of many large animals, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, some large cats, giant deer, and many others, with different losses in different regions. The causes varied and remain studied, but climate change and human activity both played important roles in many places. Warming after glacial intervals altered vegetation and water. Human hunting, burning, landscape use, and pressure on slow breeding. Large animals may have added stress at a critical time. The pattern was not identical everywhere, which is why simple explanations are not enough. Still, the late Cenozoic marks a change in the relationship between one species and the rest of the biosphere. Humans were no longer only adapting to environments, they were increasingly reshaping them. That shift became much stronger after the development of agriculture. Farming did not begin everywhere at once, and it did not spread as a single invention. In several regions, people began to cultivate plants and manage animals, creating more settled communities and larger populations. Forests were cleared, fields expanded, rivers were managed, soils were worked repeatedly. Later cities, metals, writing, industry, and global exchange greatly increased the scale of human influence. In the full length of the Phanerozoic, all of this is extremely recent. Coral reefs, forests, insects, reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, and grasslands took immense spans to arise. Human civilization occupies only a thin edge of that record. Yet its effects are now visible in atmosphere, climate, extinction rates, land cover, rivers, oceans, and the movement of species. This contrast is the quiet weight of the final Phanerozoic movement. Humans are late, brief, and biologically rooted in older life. But human activity has become geological in reach. The eon that began with shells, burrows, and Cambrian animals preserved in marine mud now contains a species able to read those rocks, name the eras, burn ancient carbon, move organisms across oceans, and alter the chemistry of the air. There is no need to make that fact grander than it is. Its scale is already large enough. The human place in deep time is not at the centre of the whole story, but at the edge of a very long inheritance. Behind every human body stands the vertebrate spine first tested in ancient waters, the limb shaped at muddy margins, the amniote legacy of land reproduction, the mammal endurance through darkness after impact, the primate life of trees, the grassland and climate pressures of the Cenozoic, and the cultural memory that allows one generation to learn from another. The Phanerozoic journey ends here not because life has reached a final form, but because the present is the point from which the record is being read. Visible life continues, unsettled and unfinished, carrying forward the deep past into choices that now belong to one very recent branch of it. The long record of the Phanerozoic does not close like a finished book. It remains open in every living system, in every coastline that shifts, in every forest that grows from older soil, in every fossil lifted from rock that once lay under an ancient sea. The eon began with visible life becoming easier for stone to remember, and across its great span the planet kept changing the terms of existence. Oceans filled with shells, reefs, fish, and predators. Plants crossed onto land and made the continents softer, greener, and more chemically alive. Vertebrates moved through water, then along the margins, then into forests and dry interiors. Supercontinents gathered and broke apart. Extinctions narrowed the future, and recoveries rebuilt it in unfamiliar forms. Dinosaurs rose in a world of warm climates and widening seas, then vanished except for the bird line that still carries their inheritance through the air. Mammals expanded after catastrophe. Flowering plants deepened their partnerships with insects. Mountains lifted weather into new patterns, and ice carved its slow signature across the later Cenozoic. Human beings arrive only at the near edge of this immense sequence, recent enough that the rest of the eon seems to stretch behind them like a depth, almost without measure. Yet the human story is not separate from that depth. It is made from it, carried in bones, breath, food, memory, and the living planet that remains unfinished. Deep time does not make the present smaller in a careless way. It gives the present context, placing it inside a continuity of change, survival, loss, and renewal. The Phanerozoic is still moving, still shaping life through climate, rock, water, and chance, and its quiet lesson is that no world is permanent, but every world leaves something behind,